I'm going to be presenting an update on the progress that's been made on the Gutenberg accessibility audit. Those results were first released to the public on May 1st, 2019, and this is very up to the minute. It will line us up with July 27th, 2020. So if you see things that aren't quite what you remember, that might be why. My name is Joe Dolson. I'm a member of the WordPress Accessibility team. You can find me on Twitter at Joe Dolson. You can check out my website at joedolson.com. You can also view these slides right now as we're going by going to http://s.joedolson.com/WPCampus There's the WPCampus feedback URL as well there, which I know has been shared widely and is available on the website. And I want to offer my special thanks to Andrea Furcia in developing this slide deck. His work in helping to identify the progress and track how tickets have changed and developed over the last 15 months was invaluable. One big caveat. As I said, this presentation is based on WordPress 5.5 Beta 4 as of July 27th. The release candidate RC1 was released yesterday, and WordPress 5.5 is scheduled for its release on August 11th. We're not expecting any major changes, but a reversion can happen at any time if some of the outstanding issues aren't solved. So things could change. This is as up to date as we can possibly make it at this moment in time. Here's a quick overview. Our goal is to achieve WCAG 2.0 at level AA as our minimum expectation for all of WordPress, and that includes Gutenberg. We will improve on WCAG 2.0 AA where it is practical. We've discussed moving to WCAG 2.1, but it's not committed to yet. And that, to be entirely honest, is mostly because we forgot to. We intended to switch to that after WordPress 5.3, but in all of the rush to get other things done, we never had that conversation. We started with 90 issues that Carl Groves from Tenon.io raised in GitHub. Following the report, he generously gave his time to adding all of that information to our GitHub repository so that we had this reference. 9 additional pieces were added by the WordPress development team. This is usually because we were splitting apart existing issues or because issues were broader than the version put in by Tenon.io and we wanted to apply it to more items. We quickly closed 34 of those because we were moving them to Track. Track is the management system we use for all of the core bugs, which is separate from how Gutenberg's issues are tracked. And we needed to get those over there because as part of this review, the Tenon.io team had reviewed the media management modal. And that media manager is not really part of Gutenberg, although it is imported into the block editor as a means to manage all of the media there. So that was a core issue, and we wanted to move it over for management there. At this time, of the 99 total tickets opened, 66 of them have been closed, 33 of them are still to do. 25 of those are on GitHub and apply directly to Gutenberg. 8 of them are on Track and apply either to the media modal or on a larger scale to the entirety of the WordPress administration. So as you can see, progress has been made. We've managed to close 2/3 of the tickets. That's a good start. It's 15 months of work to close 66 tickets. Doesn't seem like a lot, but I'm going to go into some detail on what has taken so long, what our successes have been, and where we've had some challenges in the process. But to be positive, let's start with how we've progressed. Where have we been successful in this? If you want to follow the progress along, there's a project in GitHub in the Gutenberg repository where we're tracking everything that came out of the WPCampus audit. There's also a keyword on Track where we track all of those tickets. So you can always take a look and see where things stand in terms of our progress towards these goals. These are not the only accessibility issues we're working on, but these particular trackers are specifically focused on what's come out of the WPCampus audit. There are some great successes that have come out of this. GitHub issue 15331, which was raised as part of the audit in this talk will be, it was about the problem with the block toolbars. Now, when you activate a block in Gutenberg, it brings up a toolbar for all of the tools to manage what that particular block does and looks like. Making things bold, making things centered, making things left aligned, whatever you're choosing to do, that's in this toolbar. And the entire toolbar was tabbable. And that was the only way to navigate it, which, if there were only 4 options in there, is fairly manageable, but for some complex toolbars was extremely challenging. So as part of this development, it has now been remodeled so that it follows the ARIA toolbar pattern. This particular toolbar is fully updated and follows a predictable, known pattern. This is a huge win and a huge change that's been very successful. Another big change was the observation in Gutenberg of a large number of cases where focus was not visible in high contrast modes. This spawned a large number of tickets. And in fact, it was something that hadn't really been looked at in detail in the admin anywhere. So while this is not finished, there's still a lot to do and a lot to examine. This is something where we've managed to do a significant amount of work globally auditing high contrast modes in WordPress and making a lot of changes to make sure focusable elements are visible in that context. This is another place where that audit went well beyond what we actually found in Gutenberg and was able to apply globally. As I said, one of the things that got audited in the course of this was the media manager. And this is something that has been a thorn in the side of the accessibility team for years. It's been an area that needed a lot of work and needed a lot of careful attention. And one of its major barriers is the fact that it is the one piece of WordPress that was written in backbone.js, and we had a paucity of knowledge of how that worked. So as part of this progress, there was a huge amount of effort put towards documenting the media manager, learning the media manager, and then being able to make a lot of fixes. These are still ongoing. There are a lot of changes to be made. Some of them have barriers that are posing challenges in the process of building the application. But a lot of progress is moving forward, and it has improved significantly. As I said, there were 34 issues originally moved over to the core tracker, and of those we have in fact only got 8 still open, and pretty much all of those issues applied to the media manager. So that's a lot of discrete improvements that have been made. Among the media management changes are improvements to making the icons more consistent, to eliminating invisible buttons, improving focus, improving high contrast, eliminating breakages involving enlarged font sizes so that people who need enlarged fonts can work with it better, changing the reading order so that the read order by a screen reader is the same as the visual order, labeling fields better, improving the live search so it actually announces that it does something, and exposing the status messages to assistive technology, plus many more. This is just a subset of things that have been changed. But there's still a lot of big things there's still a lot of big things left to be done. Among these, there's the replacement of infinite scroll. And this is something that needs to happen throughout the WordPress admin. And in fact, the work to replace the infinite was finished for WordPress 5.5, but it's not going to be able to be released. And I'll talk about that later, because that's an example of the types of reasons and barriers that have been in front of us that have prevented us from resolving some issues. When I go through all of that, I'll talk about why infinite scroll isn't finished. And then there's a large number of various UI and form characteristics that are deeply built into how the media manager works that have posed challenges in figuring out how to make them all work together. So those are a big process that still needs to move forward. One challenge, and this was a big challenge in trying to figure out where we are in terms of working through the accessibility audit, is that just because an issue has been closed doesn't mean that it's actually been finished. Sometimes issues are closed for other reasons. As an example, we've got the GitHub issue 15314. This issue was on keyboard navigation. It's a big issue in GitHub. There were 6 separate examples of complex and confusing keyboard navigation that was built into Gutenberg. We have, in fact, addressed all of those 6 examples, and they have each been resolved. And because of that, the issue was closed. However, the overall topic spawned a large group of issues that we have expanded out from this. This is a set of issues labeled as keyboard and focus issues in Gutenberg that in the repository we're trying to track and pin down all of the various missing pieces. So there are still 30 new issues open that came out of this one. I don't want to dismiss the fact that a huge amount of work was done on getting this progress moved forward. There was a lot done. Those 6 examples that were resolved are not 6 little bugs. They're 6 structural efforts that got massively revamped to make them work effectively. But they drew attention to a number of other various issues that we need to keep working towards. Another thing is the table block metadata. The table block in GitHub, the table block in Gutenberg is one of the ones that released in the original release in a very poor state. It had pretty much no ability to define any kind of header cell, to give it any kind of real metadata and make it a data table. And yet it wasn't labeled as being presentational either. So when Tenon.io raised this, they called for a specific scope of remediation to fix it. Those specific items were fixed, and the table block can be made reasonably accessible now. However, the scope of the ticket was very limited, and so now there is a new issue, which is trying to expand it so that it is more flexible. Because even as it is now, while you can make an accessible table out of it, you can only do that if your data is structured such that it only requires headers in the top row. It can't support a column of header cells. The captions are not done correctly, and you actually can't create a table that is labeled as presentational, which is a big limitation. And I just left the presentation. I don't know why. Give me one moment. Moving on, there's the topic of video captions. This is another example of why a GitHub issue might have been closed. This one was closed because we felt that it was really 2 separate and discrete issues. And so this one got closed in favor of those new issues. Neither of those issues, however, have been solved. This is what makes it very difficult in looking at just sheer numbers to get a sense of the scope of work that's actually been performed. These are important issues. These video captions are a major failure to achieve right now. And the reason for that is that we currently have literally no way to add captions to a video file using Gutenberg. There is no way to do it. You have to actually switch to the classic editor in order to make that happen. This is a big gap, and mostly it's a problem of deciding on what the UI needs to be. So this is moving forward. We hope to be able to solve that soon. We do need people to dive in and help work on it. But overall, there's been a lot of success because of the expansion of scope of the issues raised in the Gutenberg accessibility audit. It's allowed us to spread out and focus throughout the admin on things like high contrast mode and effect color contrast, the use of ARIA current, changing reading order, using better labels for our fields, and better keyboard focus handling, and of course, the very important elimination of the worst interface method ever, infinite scroll. These aren't all finished, but it's a huge success just to be able to take all of that data and apply it on a much broader level to the overall site. But there are a lot of big issues still not solved. We have challenges ahead of us that we need to keep moving forward on and keep thinking about. Some of these challenges are inherent to the goals we're trying to achieve. Some of them are governmental and structural in the organization that is WordPress. Some of them are technical. But I'm going to talk through some of the challenges we've had to work through. First of all, our goal is to meet WCAG 2.0 at level AA. And while that's a perfectly reasonable goal in itself, WCAG is limited. The Web Content Accessibility Guidelines assume specific classes of issues. To make an assumption that your form fields are a fairly traditional form field. So any access issue that crops up that's not really defined in the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines is hard for us to pin down. It's hard to present data about, and it's hard to defend. And the Gutenberg developers are creative, and these issues do crop up a lot. New fields show up in unexpected ways, and we have to tackle them when they do. One example is in WordPress 5.5, there's a redesign of the block mover. This is the tool that allows you to move the block from one location to another in your document. As of WordPress 5.4, it was on the side of the block, and it had two separate controls. There was a drag and drop with two arrows to move up or down, and a block switcher, and they've been moved. From here, they have now been moved out of the side to the top bar. That change is very reasonable, and there are very good arguments for why it happened. Those changes needed to happen because of issues relating to having multiple blocks next to each other, such as in a multi-column layout. Those were interfering with each other, covering content, creating problems. So the need for a redesign was real. But those two controls were combined into one. So now the block switcher, the block dragging tool, and the block arrows up and down all look like one tool. And so this single visual surface is serving three separate purposes. You click it to change the block type, you click and hold it to drag the block somewhere, or you click on the arrows that are part of it to move it up, down, or not pictured, right or left. This is still being redesigned, and I hope that the final design that ships in WordPress 5.5 has changed. But for right now, this is a major concern, and it's something that the WCAG rules are struggling to really capture, because it's really a combination of many different issues. This very fact that a single tool is serving several different purposes makes it challenging to work through. Another example was that the block inserter has been refactored in WordPress 5.5. In 5.4, it was a modal. The focus was constrained within that device, and the blocks were grouped into expandable sections. It was all accessible, it was fine, it had been worked through quite thoroughly. In WordPress 5.5, it is no longer a modal, and it no longer constrains tabbing. It, in fact, instead pushes the content over to the right to avoid overlapping it. And the blocks are no longer grouped in collapsible sections, they're now listed out individually. So while there's no clear technical reason that this is an accessibility problem, the blocks can be used, they can be tabbed through. There are some significant issues with the fact that there are 70 blocks, and if you need to use your keyboard to get to the last block because you can't remember what it's called, so you can't search for it, it's a very long process. If it was a modal, you could even just reverse tab and navigate yourself back to the end. But this is a change that it doesn't necessarily technically change any accessibility issues. You can still skip through it. You can still navigate it in multiple ways, but it's much, much more difficult to use. And so we're trying to argue against some of those aspects of those changes and try and figure out a better way forward. We're constantly fighting regressions. And this has a lot to do with the fact that Gutenberg is built in React. There's an enormous amount of DOM changes involved in the process, and those changes can be very unpredictable. We can have very unexpected major breakages caused by something that seems to be very minor. An example of this is that in WordPress 5.3, the use of drop-down menus within Gutenberg broke in Safari and VoiceOver. This was very difficult to pin down. It was reported in November, and then it took months before people figured out exactly what was going on because the actual change was very unpredictable. What was happening is as you navigated through it, some elements within the drop-down menus behaved differently from others. Eventually, it was noticed that this was specifically being a problem in menu item radio and menu item checkbox. And it was because there was a prevent default action being run that was only executing on menu items. So in the end, it was a very simple change and it was simple to fix, but it should have been caught far, far sooner. If at the time it was first committed, that had been tested in both screen readers with Safari and VoiceOver and miscellaneous other keyboard testing tools, we would have immediately known this commit caused this problem, and now you know you can really nail down what that change was much more quickly. That is a change that really shouldn't have taken 8 months to resolve. We're fighting regressions because of constant design changes. And these happen for good reasons on many occasions. The need to update the design as WordPress slowly moves into the new phases on Gutenberg is important. It needs to adjust to fit the new features that are being developed. But it does mean a design is imposed and we discover it and have to completely retest it because it might be completely different. It's not just going to be a new skin on the old structural changes that we need to explore and identify. So this tendency to replace entire interfaces like the block inserter or restructure and redesign existing interfaces like the block mover or changer, randomly change button styles, add new field designs, or add new features is creating a constant need to revisit things that have already been solved. And that is a challenge. And some of that is inevitable and essential because of the constant changes to the system. However, there are systems that really need to be put into place to monitor this on a day-to-day basis and be able to test things constantly so that we're not constantly coming back to it and trying to rebuild from scratch when we discover something has changed. There is developer resistance. And this is one of the most frustrating things is there can be topics that we as accessibility specialists on the team consider to have been solved and consider to be obvious concerns. And it can be frustrating when they suddenly disappear. One example of this is the presence of a visible focus on your selected block, which was implemented a very long time ago in Gutenberg, early on in the process. And for those of us on the accessibility team, we were like, great, they agreed with us. They implemented this change that we asked for accessibility. It's great. And then suddenly we discovered that it's gone. And the argument was that we didn't need it anymore because people now understand the interface, which I think is ludicrous. I don't think there's ever an argument that people understand an interface, especially one that's changing constantly. And then there's a constant need to try and track things like visible labeling and the focus for independent parts of block fields. There are tons of blocks that have multiple parts, like the block quote, which has a quote and a citation as a separate field, or images that will have an image and a caption. And those secondary fields are frequently only indicated by placeholders. and those are faint. They're hard to see. There's no outline. So they're hard to find and hard to recognize as present. And this is partially an argument between making the visual of the editor look as much like the outcome as possible, and partially an unwillingness to accept that the editing experience has to be and is essentially different from the published experience. There's a lack of structured oversight, and this mostly affects us in the accessibility team because there's a lack of any real leadership role that looks at the WordPress design holistically. Each piece develops independently, each design element changes, and each time there's a new major feature added, there's a very good chance that it will be added with a wholly new design. And that creates a lot of burden for the accessibility team because it's so many unique new pieces to explore. Gutenberg is obviously the topic we're looking at today and is very prominent. It uses different design guidelines, different expectations, different colors. But this also happened with something like the site health check, which is a fairly minor feature. It's small, but it uses a different design than the rest of the site. The customizer was also a completely different thing. The themes page uses a different design that was not imposed on other pages. And the media views, when they were implemented a very long time ago, used a different design. Every time a new design comes in, we have to look at it as something extra we have to explore. And finally, there are implementation challenges. There are real technical reasons that we have to actually wait until other things are resolved before we can fix the problem. So number one for that is identifying blockers and dependencies. And I mentioned that the infinite scroll was an example for this. And the reason we haven't been able to remove that is because the collection of media items is not the same if you're looking at it in list view or in gallery view. And so this infinite scroll has some strangeness about what it expects in the collection and what it actually gets. And that caused the pagination and the ability to load more to be a little unpredictable and undependable. So before we can fix that infinite scroll, we have to fix the collection inconsistency. And that could have conceivably happened in 5.5, except that we really didn't discover it until it was already a little bit too late. That will probably happen very early in 5.6, however. There's backwards compatibility issues for plugins and for themes. This is a constant issue. There's always the problem that if a plugin or a theme is using a feature, we have to make sure that when we make a change, it's something that we can either document effectively and make sure it can be changed easily, or that it's something that will not have an change that breaks a plugin or a theme. It's great that we can change themes on the fly to make them more accessible, but that doesn't really help us if in the process we've broken it for other people. So there's one big issue, one of those really epic issues about how we handle alt text assignment. Because right now, basically one version of alt text is stored in the WordPress database, and it is automatically inserted when you add an image to your post. But that is likely to frequently cause bad alt texts, because realistically, alt text is context dependent. If your featured image is used on your single post page as a header and it's ornamental and it's fabulous, maybe it doesn't even need anything. But if on the same site that featured image is used on the home page as a link to the post, it has a completely different need for an alt text in that context. So we're trying to explore what we can do with changing that whole model, but it's a very big process and there's a lot of work to do to get there. There's technical debt. One issue, I don't think anybody here is going to be surprised by the possibility that there's technical debt in WordPress. If you are, I have nothing to say. At any rate, there is technical debt. And GitHub issue 15328, which was part of the Gutenberg audit, demonstrates an automatic change of context when the status is changed to private on a draft. Now, it is a well-known and well-documented thing to avoid, to do automatic changes of context when you change the value of a control. And this particular control is a radio button, so it really should not be doing that. But there's a technical reason. And the problem is that WordPress has both published and unpublished statuses. Private is a published status. So if you're changing it on a draft, that would potentially mean it would have to automatically publish your post unless you confirm it. So rather than just change that status, it confirms with you, do you really want to do this? It's going to publish your post. There's no way to assign a draft post as something that is going to be private. So that is a technical thing that needs to be resolved before this can be changed. It wasn't a problem in the classic editor, because the classic editor only saved any changes when you hit save. And so you'd have knowledge and context for when that change happened. But because Gutenberg saves things in the background, it is simply going to auto-publish if you don't have some kind of way of definitively stopping that action. And finally, there's just the breadth of scope. Some of these tickets are very large. There's a lot to do, many, many pieces to handle. The support with speech recognition is a huge topic. The alt text revisions are big. The media modal is big. Addressing color contrast, well, it seems simple because there are so many unique designs and so many unique pairings of colors. It's actually very challenging to figure out which design changes you're going to make and try and make them global and refine things. And that's been in progress for some time, but there's still a lot to be done. In summary, before I take questions, there is major work remaining. Some of the issues raised from the Gutenberg audit, like eliminating infinite scroll throughout WordPress, moving keyboard focus more efficiently to the block settings panel rather than having this laborious effort required to move between your block and the settings for that block, adding support for video captions, improving browser shortcuts because they have conflicts, or allowing user customizable shortcuts, and just in general improved communication of the ongoing status reports and changes that are happening within Gutenberg are all big issues that need to be tackled. So the big question, did the audit achieve its goal? And I can't answer that directly, but I can talk about what it did achieve and what it didn't achieve. It definitely increased the motivation to follow through on accessibility issues. In general, there's a lot more attention paid to accessibility in WordPress development and in Gutenberg development than there was prior to the audit. There's much more awareness of the types of issues that need to be addressed. It provided a lot of focus to drive tracking and creation of new issues and tickets. It caused us to assess a large number of issues that we may have not otherwise had time to get to across the whole interface. It saved an enormous amount of time for the accessibility team because some of that groundwork was already done. And the overall accessibility of Gutenberg is vastly improved today over what it was at its original release. But still, only 2/3 of the issues raised have been solved. That's a long ways away from fixing it. There are continuing arguments over what is actually acceptable for accessibility. But it didn't resolve the satisfaction of how we define accessibility for WordPress. Key features like adding video captions are simply still not possible without editing the code directly. And there's still a heavy dependence on placeholders and icon-only controls. So these are some big issues that heavily affect a lot of people with various types of disabilities that have not been resolved. So there's a lot of progress. It's not done yet. We're still working forward, but we hope to get there. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, I'll take them in my remaining 5 or 6 minutes. I will certainly answer them on the Q&A on the watch page, and I will try and get to anything I don't get to live as soon as I can after the talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joe. I'm going to try to get through as many as I can for you in that time that you have left. One question that came up from an attendee in the chat is asked, is there data on how many overall tickets exist now? It looked like the numbers from the start of the presentation were number of tickets the beginning of the audit. I imagine the number of tickets is very different after all the other tickets have been added, original tickets were closed in preference, and so on and so on.
Yeah, so the number of tickets I was talking about at the beginning of the presentation were the number of tickets specifically raised coming from the audit. I could come up with a number for you, which is the number of total accessibility tickets currently open, and it is in the several hundreds. But it's very, very difficult to do the kind of archaeology to figure out which ones connect or were inspired by things that came from the Gutenberg audit, because obviously many of those tickets were raised coming from versions of the software that were never tested by Tenon. Many issues were raised prior to the audit, because this is a chronically ongoing process. So I don't have an answer for you in terms of the audit to talk about how many tickets actually relate to that. I can definitely say exactly how many came from it directly, but that secondary number would be incredibly difficult to extrapolate.
Thank you very much. There was another question from another audience member that asked, are there any accessibility experts involved with the design/redesigns you were mentioning earlier? From their point of view, it sounded like in the midst of changes, they are actively breaking up things that weren't originally a problem.
So involved is a difficult word when it comes to things like WordPress development in general. There are frequently people involved at various stages, but because the nature of the development is very independently driven, and in all honesty, it's driven by, like so many things, it's economically driven, because the people who can contribute are basically the people who have either enough personal resources that they can contribute their time for free, or it's people who are being paid to contribute. And the amount of time any given person can contribute at any given time is hugely variable. So I'm hesitant to answer that very directly because I don't know the background of exactly how each individual piece was developed. What I can say is we members of the accessibility team try to monitor as much as we can, as early as we can, of what happens in Gutenberg. But it is not uncommon for something to suddenly come to our attention when it's already finished. And that's partially because there are hundreds of issues and tickets to monitor. The accessibility team takes the responsibility of monitoring Gutenberg, WordPress core, the WordPress.org, the WordPress themes program. It's an enormous task, and we don't have the resources, the people, to actually keep up with everything. So essentially, I think I would say that there's not reliably an accessibility expert involved in everything. There's certainly no accessibility expert involved as a matter of process or requirement, because there is no real structure to how WordPress develops things. It's all very much independently generated, and people work on what they have time and interest to work on.
Great, thank you. So there was a similar question that another attendee asked that I think sort of extends your answer a little bit more. And the question was, why hasn't the Gutenberg or WordPress development team tried partnering with groups like W3C, who oversee WCAG, to find a way forward on issues that are being debated?
Well, we are actually in fairly frequent conversations with people from W3C. But to be totally honest, those people don't have any more time than the rest of us do. They're also managing enormous projects that have an enormous amount of things to do. So it's not so simple as just saying, hey, W3C, can you advise us on this? Because realistically, accessibility is not a fully objective world. There's a lot of subjectivity in trying to interpret what actually these rules mean. And having participated on standards development for things like WCAG, I know that there are a lot of debates before anything is even finalized about what What is the best way to say this? What is our actual goal, and what does this mean? So we do try and get that kind of feedback, but we can't demand anything. We can't expect anybody to give a specific answer. I know Wilco Fears has participated on a couple of things, and I know that Hidde de Vries has joined in on a couple of things on occasion. I can't remember everybody who's talked at any given time. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks a lot, Joe. I think we're about out of time. We're just at a minute over 45 past, and there's a couple more questions in the chat. So as you mentioned, I think it might be best to follow up on the website for that. But Joe, thank you so very much for this session.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.